In section 4 and 6, I've combined them because they look at the organisms that make up a food chain and a food web, and it also looks at the the different types of ecological pyramids, which are also a way of showing how energy moves through an ecosystem. So the food webs and food chains are basically showing how energy goes from one organism to another. So a food chain is a model that shows a sequence of feeding relationships. So a food chain links species by what they eat and what eats them. A food chain follows the connection between one producer and a single chain of consumers within an ecosystem. So for example, you see that there's grass, the cottontail rabbit will eat the grass, and then that rabbit is eaten by a hawk. Not all consumers are alike, just like I'd mentioned in the last section, is that you've got herbivores. Herbivores eat only plants. Carnivores, they're only going to eat other animals. Omnivores are going to eat both plants and animals. That's what we are as humans. Detrivores are going to eat dead organic matter. This would be things like earthworms and stuff like that. Decomposers are detrivores that break down organic matter into simpler compounds. So a decomposer, an example of that would be like a fungi or a mushroom. Now, within an ecosystem, you can have the organisms classified as specialists or generalists. So specialists, they're going to consume only one specific type of organism. And then, like I said, the generalists are going to consume a varying diet. So there's going to be more than one thing that they're going to eat. We have the trophic levels. So a trophic level are the nourishment levels in a food chain. So each step in a food chain is referred to as a trophic level. So you have primary consumers are herbivores that eat producers. Then you've got secondary consumers. They're going to be the carnivore that eats the herbivore. And then you will have tertiary consumers, and they're carnivores that eat secondary consumers. Omnivores, such as humans, that eat both plants and animals, may be listed at different trophic levels in different food chains. So depending on what they've eaten, they're gonna, some of them, if they eat a plant, that would make them a primary consumer. If they eat something that has eaten a plant, then they're going to be a secondary consumer, and then so on. So they could, humans could be any one of those three. So when we talk about food webs and food chains, an organism that they may have multiple feeding relationships in an ecosystem, and that's what a food web is a food web is going to emphasize the complicated feeding relationships and the energy flow in an ecosystem. So it is very rare for it just to be this plant only gets eaten by this animal and that animal is only eaten by this animal and so on. It's usually this animal eats this plant and this plant and this plant, and it's eaten by this animal, and this animal, and that animal is eaten by this one, this one, and this one. So a food web is a more complex feeding relationship than the simple food chain. And that's what the picture down below is showing, is you end up seeing that multiple things are eaten by the different ones in that picture. So moving on to section 6, section 6 is looking at how energy moves in an ecosystem. So we look at that by what are known as energy pyramids, and we're going to end up the pyramids compare energy used by producers and other organisms in the trophic levels. Between each tier of an energy pyramid, up to 90% of that energy is lost as heat to the atmosphere. The remaining 10% is what gets passed on to the next consumer. So if you're sitting in class and you were to get eaten by a polar bear, you could laugh at that polar bear because the polar bear is only getting 10% of the energy from you. You used the remaining 90% and lost it as heat. So only 10% of that energy at each tier is transferred from one level to the next. That's what you're seeing here. As you see, energy is being lost, energy is being transferred. So it's going to keep going up as you go. And we'll look at the different types of energy pyramids here. So one of them is what's known as a biomass pyramid. Biomass is a measure of the total dry mass of organisms in a given area. So biomass is basically the weight of all the living things there in that environment. So if you look at that picture here, you end up seeing that as the biomass is larger, it's going to means it's getting more energy. And as you go from one level to the next, you're going to end up seeing that there's going to be smaller and then smaller amount of biomass from one level to the next. So this human is not going to get very much of the biomass below it. So you end up there's not as much energy, so there's going to be fewer organisms that it can support. Another way of looking at it would be what's known as a pyramid of numbers. Pyramid of numbers are going to show the actual number of organisms at each one of those trophic levels. So once again, if you look here, you'll see that there's 5 million producers, there's 500,000 primary consumers, 5,000 secondary consumers, and 5 tertiary consumers. So once again, a lot of energy at that low level, so you can have lots of organisms, and then you go up to the next level, not as much energy is going to be there, so there's fewer organisms as you go. So a vast number of producers are required to support even a few top-level consumers. And then the final one that's not really listed on here of the pyramid of energy would just be looking at an energy pyramid in itself, saying that there's only this amount of energy at this level, only this at that level, and so on. So you've got the pyramid of numbers, the biomass, and then you've got the energy pyramid, but energy would fall in with these other ones here as well. So that's the end of the notes for section 4 and 6.